Welcome back to the program. We are joined today by Larry Johnson, a former CIA analyst, to discuss the Russian weaponry. So it's great to see you again, Larry.
Hey, Glenn, thanks for the invite. As always, it's a pleasure to chat with you.
So the way I understand it, it's quite common or it's a common recurrence that the CIA has tended to put out some disinformation, and then, of course, the information goes through the system and then act upon the same information. So a problem with disinformation campaigns, one often end up fooling oneself. So I'm not sure if you have any experience or knowledge in this area, but more specifically to our talk today is that information warfare, it's a very important component of the proxy war in Ukraine, simply to keep the war going. So NATO seems to rest on two important narratives. That is, Russia has, the most evil of intentions, nothing of legitimate security concerns, but also they're weak and they can be stopped. And I guess sometimes we end up in an awkward situation where we say they're committing a genocide, yet when they send 700 drones and you have 2 deaths, I mean, it's very tragic, but it's not a good indicator of a genocidal intent. But today, what I wanted to ask about more is this: the arguments we make that the Russians are on the brink of collapse. They had missile shortage, almost running out since March of 2022. Fighting with shovels, stealing chips from washing machines.
And don't forget the refrigerators.
Refrigerators, yeah. But it's kind of interesting, because if you go to the Ukrainian Telegram channels, they actually warn against this. They say a lot of their soldiers, they go out in the field that they assume to be fighting, backwards, untrained, human waves of Russians, and then they come to the battlefield and they report that the Russians are coming better trained, better equipped, with more weapons and better weapons as well. So that this buying into our own propaganda can be quite harmful. Anyways, where I was going with this is that you recently got back from Russia, and I was hoping that, since in the West we tend to fool ourselves as well, if you could enlighten us with some of the discussions you had, because you spoke to some, 2 Russian generals, was it? And what is it that we actually know now about their weaponry, or at least what you have learned?
Well, yeah, I was fortunate. I had 28 different interviews where I was asking the questions. I was being Glenn Deason. I'm asking the questions, eliciting the responses. And it was a broad base. I spoke to, I think, at least 4 members of the Duma, 2 senior officials in the Putin administration. Um, Apart from the 2 generals, 2 other, one a colonel and one an enlisted guy, but who's a famous sniper. He's actually Serbian, but has been fighting in the Donbass for 10 years. Prominent analysts, reporters. So I mean, it was a broad base, and there were no limitations imposed upon what I could ask. Subject matter, it was free, wide open. One of the generals I spent a lot of time with, General Opti Alaudinov, a Chechen lieutenant general. He's the one that conceived of and led the attack in Suja. Remember when the Russians marched through a gas pipeline for 13 kilometers? And they did that hunched over. They weren't standing straight up. You can't march that way. You have to, sort of crouch down and move. I challenge anybody to go out and see if they could walk just 1 kilometer that way. But they advanced up that pipeline carrying weapons, carrying ammunition, which means it was a load, and carried out a very successful surprise attack on the Ukrainian forces and ended up destroying them. So when I hear the West talk about the collapse of Russia and the weakness of the military, I step back and say, okay, let's just do an inventory. Let's look at weapons. Let's start with artillery. next is, who produces more artillery shells? The United States and all of NATO combined, or Russia? Well, the answer there is Russia. Who is able to produce more artillery barrels? So the barrels on these artillery pieces, after you fire a number of rounds, ammunition, shells through them, the barrels get worn out and you have to replace them. Well, again, who builds more barrels? Russia. How about hypersonic missiles? These are missiles that travel at the speed of Mach 6 or greater and can be steered, can be maneuvered. Russia has at least 5 different types of hypersonic missiles. How many does the West have? None. None. Then just this week, Russia made 2 types of, I'll call them cruise missiles. One operates in the water, underwater, like a torpedo. The other operates like the Tomahawk missile. Both are powered by a nuclear reactor. That means they've got a miniature nuclear reactor that is generating the energy that provides the thrust for these 2 type of weapon systems. And both are capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. So they are delivery vehicles. They themselves are not nuclear weapons. So does the United States or NATO have anything comparable? No. Drone production. Again, Russia surpasses the United States and NATO in the production of drones. The Russians have chosen to go a more, let's call it, inexpensive route. They produce Shahed drones and Garan drones that are, I think some cost $10,000, so maybe some $50,000. Quite a contrast with the MQ Predator Reaper drone, MQ-9, $35 million. So just in terms of equipment, let's come back. Tanks. Russia is producing on average 600 brand new tanks a year. The United States is not producing brand new tanks. They are in the process of refurbishing existing tanks, the M1 Abrams. And has been demonstrated on the battlefield. The M1 Abrams is really ill-suited to conduct operations in Ukraine, unlike in sharp contrast to the Russian tanks. So, find me one area with military weapon systems where the West can say, oh, we're better than the Russians. There isn't one, not one. There are multiple ones where Russia can say they are superior to and well advanced ahead of the West. So this gaslighting where Trump keeps saying, oh, we got the best military in the world. Really? We couldn't even stop the Houthis from shutting down the Red Sea. We tried, and in that 7 weeks, that is, there was the continuation of Operation Prosperity Guardian. I forget they applied a new name to it. The United States lost 7 MQ-9 Predator drones. So that was almost, $260 million worth of drones down the toilet, or in this case, dropped to Earth. Then the damage that was done to 3 combat aircraft that were lost. So after 7 weeks of that, the United States says, okay, we win. We declare victory, and we left. So if we can't handle the Houthis, how in the world are we going to handle the Russians if perchance the United States and Russia get into combat? The fact of the matter is Russia's got a decided advantage. And the Russians understand this, but they also carry with them, and General Alaudinov was very clear about this. He says, we're fighting for our existence, for our families, for our land. And we will not stop until it is secure. There's nothing the West can offer, say, or do other than leave us alone and get out of our land. That's what Russia wants, and that's what they will get.
Yeah, for me, when I hear all this war propaganda about how poorly equipped they are, the human waves, all these things which are easy to disprove, it's people forget that it's how dangerous it is. That if you underestimate their capabilities
Right.
and exaggerate our own, you end up with assumptions like escalation dominance, that we can always turn up the heat, knowing that at some point the Russians would have to back down because we have the most powerful weapons. Or as you said, if we go into a direct war, the likelihood of us actually winning, because at least here on the European side, it appears that it's assumed it's an issue of will. If the Americans were just really into this war and they put everything behind it, then the Russians wouldn't stand a chance because, they're a tiny economy the size of Spain, and they're a gas station masquerading as a
Right.
country, even though they're outproducing the industrial might of their military, outproducing all of NATO many times over. So it's Obama also made a point once that the Russians would want it more to win. That is to sacrifice everything because it's existential for them. It's not on the other side of the planet, and
Right.
the benefit of logistics. It's the right next door. It's so yeah. With all of this idea that if we're just patriotic enough, that means we have to talk down the Russian capabilities. It seems absurd. A lot of self-harm will come from this. But you did go through a lot of these weapons, but the newest weapon is this new Borevestnik
Yeah.
nuclear-powered missile. Well, why? Well, first of all, why does it matter that it's nuclear-powered, and how can we understand the comparative advantage or competitive advantage of this missile?
Well, if you go in and look, go into any of the AI search engines and ask them to pull up, give me a list of the intermediate range and intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they always come with a distance, a maximum distance they can travel. This cruise missile has no maximum distance. It can fly around the world. It's no longer, because in the past, the capability of a missile to travel, X, 1,000 miles, 2,000 miles, 3,000 miles was always dependent upon the amount of fuel you could have, whether it was liquid or solid fuel. And, it was the amount of fuel on board creates weight, which then limits, the potential size of the warhead, etc. The Boreveshnik and the Poseidon, they're not bound by the amount of fuel on board. They basically have an unlimited fuel supply because of this nuclear reactor. And this then opens up some really interesting non-military opportunities. Can you imagine an airplane fueled with a nuclear reactor, a small nuclear reactor that provides all the power and thrust for an aircraft to take off and land? That, I'm not sure what the initial upfront cost would be, but imagine the cost in fuel savings over time. That's just one aspect. This also applies to space travel. So no longer you're going to have these booster stages that they have to take off until it runs out of gas, and then it drops off, and another one kicks on, and then it runs out of gas and it drops off. This is going to change the design of spaceships, where all of a sudden they can take off and land without having to have all these boosters, because they will have the power on board in terms of their own nuclear reactor, that once it's running, they're flying. And then it opens up the path, it makes it easier to talk about traveling to Mars. And so, I'm sure there's more research still needing to be done. But again, this reflects the innovation that is characteristic of Russia, and has been really over the last it actually goes back to the days of Stalin. One of the most interesting conversations I had, I mean, they were all fascinating, but I did get to talk to this economic minister, Galushka. He's got right now the number one selling book in Russia that deals with sort of the history of the Russian economy. And he goes back and he explains in detail what Stalin is scenarios is sort of, let's call it the good side of Stalin, what was done in terms of industrializing Russia. And the anti-Stalinists come out and say, "Oh, they would have done that anyway with or without Stalin." Well, all we know is we got history, and the history shows that Russia achieved tremendous advancements in industrialization from 1925 through 1955, and it was sort of symbolized at the end with Yuri Gagarin being the first man in space, beating the United States in that race. But what Mr. Galushka said was, he says, the West doesn't understand that we are self-sufficient. Yes, we are involved with international trade, and international trade does contribute to our gross domestic product. But he said, if we came to a world where we had to build a wall around Russia and rely only upon what we produce here in this country, we don't need anything. There's not a single thing we need from any country overseas that's essential to our economy, because we have it all here domestically. And we've seen it just over the course of the last 3 years, an example of that. Previously, when Russia would buy aircraft for civilian and commercial flights, they were purchasing, I think, from Boeing principally. Sanctions get kicked in. No more Boeing for you. So Russia goes, okay, we'll build our own. And in the last 3 years, they have now produced, built, produced, and test flighted a commercial jetliner. And now we're going to start mass producing them. Whoa. Bad news for Boeing and potentially for Airbus, because now Russia's going to be able to build enough that they may even start selling them into countries in the global south that previously were buying from Boeing or Airbus. So Russia's just demonstrated that if you try to shut us out of markets, we can circumvent you. And that was, Galushka's point was, the West thinks that they can sanction us in a way that it's going to force us to change. And he said that they don't have that leverage. It doesn't exist.
Everyone used to teach a security strategy at the university in Sydney. I always told students, don't hate your opponents, because if you hate them, that results in poor analysis. That they're backwards, whatever, and with the poor analysis, you get poor policies and you lose. So you should always respect your opponents. But it's I think that's one of the great curses of today, that we can't recognize any strength of our adversaries. It has to be always talking down, and we end up in this predictably stupid situations, which should have been, again, predictable. But you did mention something very interesting, though, about also what Putin mentioned, that these technologies for the Burevestnik missile, that they can be also applied in space exploration, because this is how, I guess, the geoeconomic era has turned things around. Because in the past, people were concerned about exporting commercial technologies because they could have a military application. In the geoeconomic era, we have the technology with military capabilities being used to transfer to give commercial advantage.
Right.
And so there's a lot of interesting. Well, it's also a way of indirectly subsidizing your commercial industries by having, well, state-funded, of course, military technologies working with private industries. But no, I think there's often many people ignoring that the Russians actually have made huge advances in their technological sovereignty. They have actually a very decent autonomous digital ecosystem of their own tech giants who's dominating in Russia, as opposed to relying on foreigners. And in general, the efforts to, because in the 1990s, they just exported oil and gas and they imported all goods, and it led to deindustrialization. They reversed this now, actually. they're selling their energy, and they're using a lot of the proceeds to subsidize and finance new technological developments to gain more self-sufficiency and climb up the global value chains. A lot of this isn't ignored, but it is ignored because this is always this requirement to refer to the Russians as being backwards, and then you end up, of course, thinking you're going to fight the Russians with shovels, and you get a hypersonic missile coming your way. It's
that is a wake-up call. You're correct.
yeah. But you mentioned all these missiles, the hypersonic, the Zircon, of course, the Oreshnik is in a class of its own. But it has to be noted that a lot of these weapon systems, you don't need the Boris Vesnik missile for Ukraine. How much of this do you see being aimed as a deterrent against the West? Again, you spoke to many of the military leaders there, because I was there, was it 3 weeks, no, 2 weeks ago, and I got the impression that the Russians see a huge necessity now in terms of reviving their deterrence, because in NATO, we kind of feel a bit too comfortable just launching missiles into Moscow if we have to, without even pretending anymore that it's actually Ukraine which are launching them. So how do you see these weapon systems being developed in this greater game that we're now seeking another round of escalation?
Well, Russia is now in a position where it can both launch an attack that the West cannot stop, and it can stop most retaliatory strikes by the West by virtue of its various air defense systems, the Pantsir S-300, S-400, S-500, S-550. And they're moving, developing those capabilities pretty rapidly. Related to that, let me just point out there was a interesting piece of misinformation propaganda that was circulated Tuesday of this week. A friend of mine, Steve Bryan, wrote about it because I got back from Moscow on Tuesday, and before leaving, the news Monday and Sunday was about Putin's visit to the military headquarters, an extensive briefing with General Gerasimov, and all the coverage in Russia was very upbeat, very positive, because Putin was visiting a military headquarters. He wore a uniform. That's sort of that wasn't sending any new signal. That's just sort of because of his role as commander in chief. If he's on a military base, he will dress accordingly. But no hint whatsoever of any animus between Putin and Gerasimov. Anyway, Steve got a hold of a video that is on YouTube that showed, Putin just, chewing Gerasimov's ass up because of the failures with their defense. And so I checked with 3 different people in Russia. One of them, I think you may know, Stanislav Krapivnik. Stas, is a former U.S. Army major. But they all came back and said this was a total it was an AI fabrication, trying to create a storyline that there was conflict, disagreement between the military and Putin. No, just the opposite. So, but again, it illustrates the desperation of the West to try to create these kinds of narratives, which more often than not fool the people in the West. They don't fool the people in Russia. In my conversation with General Abdi Aludinov, he made it clear. He said, look, we follow President Putin, but the military leadership on this, Putin doesn't have military experience. He was not in the military. He is the commander-in-chief by virtue of his position as president, but it is essentially still civilian control of the military. But the actual decisions about where to attack, how to attack, what to attack with, that's being made by General Gerasimov and his general staff, which includes, generals, colonels, senior people, integration of all forces, land, sea, and air. And, Putin is deferring to them. But I was told the one area that he made a special request was minimize Russian casualties. And that's one of the reasons that we see, the slow advance, if you will, of Russia to the West. But it's methodical, and they're moving. And this year they've been moving actually much more rapidly as they've have weakened and destroyed the key elements of Ukrainians' defense capabilities. But their other objective too is to minimize civilian casualties, because in places even like Pokrovsk, you have lots of civilians who have stayed behind. They don't want to go into Ukrainian control. They're waiting for the Russians to come liberate them. So it's the attitude of the Russians is, however long it takes us, we'll take as long as we need. We're not going to be defeated. That's not an option. And there is that mentality. What's interesting is also what you said, though, about the tendency of the West to minimize the capabilities of Russia. But with respect, the Russians, you don't hear that kind of dismissive talk of the Ukrainians. In fact, they make the point, they say, the reason the Ukrainians fight so well is they're still Russian at heart. So they give them a compliment that they recognize they're relatives. They're part of they're Slavic relatives.
Yeah. No, it's well, on the propaganda, it is interesting that whenever bad news comes through, which might undermine the public's belief in the war and the willingness to keep it going, you know that something's gonna come to reset it. So now that there's a disaster, which is we talked about it before, about Pokrovsk and Kupiansk being surrounded. Well, now they are surrounded. There are thousands and thousands of Ukrainian troops which can no longer get out, which must either surrender or they will perish. And just as this is happening, you kind of just waiting, especially looking at British TV. So where's the big morale booster that we're actually winning? And that's when they came out with these reports now that Putin is fearful because he's on his last leg and a coup might be coming. I mean, this is it's becoming quite predictable. But again, no, all of this fooling ourselves with always pointing out or faking this massive weakness on the side of the Russians. It's quite dangerous, because every day that passes, the deal will be worse. Not just any deal in terms of European security architecture, but even it would be in everyone's interest to have a reasonably strong independent Ukraine as a buffer between NATO and Russia. But every day, the ability for Ukraine to rebuild after this, with all the loss of men, all the destroyed infrastructure, people fleeing the country, it's going to be impossible to have a stable Ukraine in the years to come. It might demise or fall apart as a nation. Nobody gains from this. Yet this story is this retreating into dream world of Russia being on the brink of a coup. I mean, I do get the impression sometimes that the intelligence agencies and media just go with it, and then it circles back, and then they pick up on it as if this is going to be a real story. But on that, though, we do see that as Ukraine now is losing, desperation kicks in. You see it especially here in Europe. Now we can't finance Ukraine anymore. We're broke. So now it's talk, let's just steal the Russian assets, or Ukraine suffering immensely on the battlefield. Let's send in some troops, or let's give them long-range missiles to strike Russia. All of this, all of the above, seizing Russian ships, anything to go after its energy infrastructure. I mean, all of this can trigger a direct war. How do you see the likelihood of us actually triggering a direct war with the Russians?
I think it's unlikely, simply because Europe lacks the capability. I have no doubt that they have the desire. They'd love to go, hit Russia and feel that they could damage Russia. But the reality is they don't have the inventory of weapons, and they don't have the sophistication of weapons. You know, they have enough firepower to, you know, if you will, light a bonfire in which they're going to be the fuel. Because Russia, if attacked, and Russia's not going to launch preemptive strikes against Europe under any circumstances. But if struck, Russia will retaliate in a way that will cause immense pain and suffering on the part of Europe, at least within the military realm. The one thing, you know, it's sort of, despite Western propaganda, Russia tries to avoid civilian casualties because they recognize, based on their own wartime experience, if you start killing civilians, all you do is harden the population's anger towards the attacker, and they tend to rally around the existing government, even if they hate the existing government. So Russia at least wisely understands that. If anything, they want to do what they can to weaken support for the existing government. So you do that by destroying their ability to provide services to people. And that's one of the reasons you see the Russians carrying out these attacks on the thermal power plants, hydroelectric power plants, coal-fired power plants, etc., throughout Ukraine. The Russians, their whole mentality towards this is, you know, something the West just does not want to accept or understand. But, you know, the several, not just the two generals that I talked with, but others as well, made the point. We don't need to expand to Europe. We got 11 time zones of land here. You know, we got this massive expanse into Siberia and along the border with all the stands. We don't need more land. We got plenty. And there's no resources we need to go capture. We got plenty. We got all that we need. We just want to be left alone. We would like to have a relationship with you. But unfortunately, the relationship between Russia and Europe, it's like, you know, I don't know if in your bachelor days, if you ever had a crazy girlfriend. I mean, one just completely nuts. And no matter what you tried to do to get along with her or to, you know, placate her or to, you know, give her gifts, she was always angry, always threatening. That's the relationship between Russia and Europe. Europe is the crazy girlfriend. And for the women out there, okay, the crazy boyfriend. You know, we'll be equal on, you know, not being sexist here, but I'm just talking from my own point of view, frame of reference. So there's really no foundation for a relationship, one that's based on mutual respect. The other thing that was brought home to me is the Russian mentality is not based on the zero-sum game that is the Western mentality in dealing with other countries. Instead, the Russian mentality is one of building a positive game theory that all can win, all can participate, all can benefit. They don't feel the need that I've got to win and you've got to lose. And so that is another core tenet of both Russian foreign policy and military policy. And to illustrate that is look at what happened to the Muslim population in Chechnya after the Second Chechen War that concluded in 2009, 2010. That was a brutal war. And there were a lot of people killed on both sides. Yet at the end, when it ended, Russia went out of its way to rebuild the trust and the relationship with the Chechens. They didn't seek to humiliate them. They didn't feel the need to make them suffer. It was just the opposite. In fact, I was told that Russia diverted some of its budget that should have gone to other regions in Russia and focused it on Chechnya, rebuilding it. And today, Chechnya across the board is described as just one of the most beautiful republics in Russia. And, geez, it's produced General Kadyrov, General Aludinov. So you've got these great Muslim military commanders who have played principal roles in critical battles. Kadyrov with the battle in Mariupol in May of 2022, and General Aludinov in the Battle of Kursk that concluded really in March of this year. So is that mentality, that difference in how the Russians approach, if you will, the adversary? They don't feel the need to humiliate and grind the adversary down, but they actually try to find a way to build up. So that also gives me some, when this thing ends, and it will end militarily, it's not going to end through negotiation. It gives me some optimism that if Russia could heal the wounds with the Chechens, it can heal the wounds with the Ukrainians.
Yeah, no, I'm also left with the impression now that the diplomatic possibilities are over. I think the final nail in the coffin is when Trump came back again and now suggests, well, let's go back to the ceasefire idea. This is, I think, when it was evident that diplomacy was just pointless. Of course, if there's significant changes now on the battlefield, the cities begin to fall one after another, and again, this could escalate very quickly after Pokrovsk and Kupiansk now falling apart or falling to the Russians. Then of course there might be more diplomatic will in NATO to accept some of these concessions and tell Zelensky as well. However, my last question though is in terms of the recent decisions by the United States to I see reports that the U.S. is reducing its presence now in Eastern Europe from Romania, the Baltic states, Poland, not pulling out altogether, but reducing the presence in accordance with the idea of pivoting away from Europe. This seems like a very clear signal that the process of handing over the war to the Europeans, they don't have to finish it. They can continue drag on for a few years if they can afford it, but that America's checking out or at least reducing its involvement in this. Do you see this as well, and how significant do you think this will be?
No, I think it's a step in the right direction. I think the real impetus for the complete U.S. withdrawal from Europe will be once Russia secures a military victory over Ukraine, because that will be seen, and properly so, as a complete defeat of NATO, and will expose the limitations of NATO's power. And at that point, I think you'll see the United States retreat and pull out. It probably should have pulled out years ago, in 1991. But this being in control, being the most powerful, is sort of it's a drug. It's addictive. Let me ask you a question. What is the distance north to south in Norway? What is the longest, from like the southern point of Norway to the northern point? 1,300 kilometers?
I wouldn't know.
Oh,
I should know this.
Okay. Well, the reason I ask, I'm trying to find a distance that people can understand or relate to. So if it, like in the United States, the distance from New York City to Miami, I believe, is about 1,100 miles. Let's call it 1,400 kilometers. That distance represents the entire line of contact in Ukraine.
Sorry, my European thinking is in the kilometers, because I think again you mentioned north to south. I know it's less than 2,000 kilometers, but put it between 16 and 1,800 kilometers.
Okay.
But I'm not sure what that would be in miles.
Yeah, well, no, but
1,000 or so.
But yeah, so but that would be, let's see, I think 1,600 kilometers is 1,000 miles.
Yeah.
So, and so what we're looking at roughly is It's closer to a 1,600 kilometers opposed to 1,300 kilometer line of contact. Well, even if you got 700,000 soldiers all spaced out along that line of contact, that's not a lot. That's not a lot. You have to concentrate them in certain areas. Um, so that's where Russia right now has an advantage in manpower, and Ukraine is struggling to plug gaps along that line, along that whole 1,600 kilometer line. But Russia's, the one order that Putin did give to the generals was minimize military casualties on the Russian side. So that's one of the reasons they're not, rushing ahead and full scale attacks. They move more methodically and slowly, and softening up areas with a combination of artillery, drones, glide bombs. The deal that's on the table right now that Putin laid out the conditions on June 14th of 2024, basically that the West, Ukraine and the West, acknowledge that the 5 former oblasts of Ukraine, Crimea, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, that those are permanently part of Russia. They are Russian territory, will not be given up. They won't be given back. And that all Ukrainian and NATO troops need to pull out of those territories. And Ukraine needs to renounce any intent of joining NATO, and NATO needs to withdraw out of Ukraine. Now, that's been on the table now for more than 16 months. And Putin and Gerasimov and Lavrov, they've all made it clear that the next go-round is if the West doesn't accept that, then Russia is going to take more territory. And if the people vote to stay with Russia, then that will too become Russian territory, up to and including Kiev and Odessa. So, one thing is Russia will militarily take control of Poltava, Sumy, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk. I think they'll also take control of Kiev and Odessa. Then they will hold elections, and they'll give the people a chance. Do you want to stay with Ukraine, or you want to come back to Russia? And I will predict that I think all of that territory, because they're largely Russian-speaking, will opt to go back to Russia. And so Ukraine will be just a shell of itself. The other thing, though, was fascinating. I spoke with the former Prime Minister, Azarov, who was Prime Minister from 2010 to 2014. And he said, when I took over as Prime Minister in 2010, we had 57 million Ukrainians living in Ukraine. He says today that number is 20 million. He said Ukraine has suffered a terrible loss. And, most of those have gone overseas. In fact, I told the Prime Minister, I said, well, I've got anecdotal evidence for you. My dentist in the United States is from Ukraine. And I had a broken refrigerator. The guy that came out to repair the refrigerator, Ukrainian. So, they've shown up in Florida, and I'm sure they're all along the east coast of the United States and maybe the west coast and then Europe. But 37 million people, or let's call it 35 million, that have moved out and aren't coming back. It's very difficult for a country to recover from that.
Well, Larry, thank you so much. It's sometimes one feels living a parallel universe, because the way the media is depicting what is happening versus the actual developments now. I mean, I guess my great concern now is that as the US is pulling a bit away, the Europeans feel this need to escalate, and the Russians are concerned that they let their deterrent drop and they have to rebuild it. It's as if, perfect storm is preparing for a direct confrontation, which is, as you said, the main reason to think it's not going to happen is because it will be so foolish. We will be walking into a war we can't win. but there's been a lot of foolish decision made lately. So this is my great concern that we're really going in this direction. Do you have any final thoughts before we log off?
Well, just say I think what you're doing, and people like you, like the Duran, um, just the podcast realm with Nima and Judge Napolitano and others, an alternative media perspective, because the Western media, and in particular in the United States, as it's come under the control of Western oligarchs, and you're too young to really remember this, but like 50 years ago, so I'm graduating from high school. Back then, the number of independent newspapers, independent radio stations, independent television stations, there wasn't a media. It was, if you will, pretty democratic. There was no one person that controlled and dominated the media space. Now jump ahead to here we are in 2025. It's about 5 corporations in the United States that control the media. And, pick your issue. Is it the genocide in Gaza? Is it the special military operation in Ukraine, aka the war in Ukraine? Is it the looming American attack on Venezuela? You don't find on any of the media channels now any kind of debate, any kind of genuine pushback on these issues. You look at the people who commonly show up on the various YouTube channels talking about, let's take Ukraine, where you got Jeffrey Sachs, John Mearsheimer, Doug McGregor, you've got Ray McGovern, you got Scott Ritter. Those have been the principal voices. I count myself as, attached to that grouping. I recall back, when I was doing talking head stuff on terrorism between 1994 and 2008, there were always alternative. It was never one-sided. There were 2 sides, and you could actually freely debate the issue without it devolving into a shouting match. You don't have that today. Doug McGregor once in a while, before Tucker Carlson was fired, would make it onto his show to talk about the war in Ukraine. But now there are no other voices out there. And there certainly aren't any voices in the media here speaking out about this upcoming U.S. military action against Venezuela. A complete lie, based on a lie. So what you're doing is important because you present an alternative that's outside the control of this oligarchic media. And so I just congratulate you on that.
Well, I appreciate that, Larry. So thanks again, and I hope to see you soon.